Tika the Enchantress, Part 2.
Step 1. Monocle,
Tika declared a few minutes later, strapping Bradigen's monocle to her face. She blinked, letting out a chirp of surprise when she realized that the monocle lens magnified everything several times over. The difference in what she saw between her two eyes sent her mind spinning, and she suddenly felt nauseous. Closing one eye alleviated the problem, thankfully, and looking through the monocle, she was amazed by the detail in everything around her. She could make out the tiniest bumps in the metal table beneath her. She'd always wondered why Brad had put this on for a job. For the longest of time, she had just thought it made him look cool.
"Oh, guess I know now,"
she whispered to herself before returning her attention to the task at hand. Her doll and the open dictionary were laid next to each other on the table, alongside a box of small-sized ring stones. Another box filled with rock chisels and wood carving knives had also been laid out. She had wondered for a long while what jars she should grab, and only realized that she hadn't actually been educated on any of them yet. In the end, she elected to just take some talon polish from her room. Figuring that this was all she would need, she took a moment to go over the enchanting process in her head one last time. It was a fairly simple process from a bird's eye view. First, one would need the item they wished to enchant and a ring stone. Then they would need to carve the appropriate rune into both the object to be enchanted and the ring stone. Finally, dust would need to be sanded off from the ring stone and then used to fill in the runes on the object to be enchanted. The matching runes on both stone and object would serve as the instructions for the enchantment, while the ring stone itself would serve as a power source, providing the necessary magic energy for the enchantment to do its work. It sounded simple, but there were layers to it, Tika knew. The dust had to be compressed into the engraved runes firmly to ensure they didn't fall out. The shapes of the two sets of runes had to be exactly identical, even if the sizes didn't. The dust for the runes had to come from the power source or it wouldn't work. Foreign substances couldn't be allowed into the dust, or it could throw off the entire enchantment. And finally, the ring stone and the object had to constantly remain within a certain radius of one another, or the bond created by the runes would be broken, and the object's enchantment would fail until they were brought together again. But Tika had watched Bradigen enchant many things during her tenure as his apprentice, and she was confident that she could do at least one rune. She was a Kraven after all, and Kraven had a very good memory.
"Okie dokie, here goes nothing,"
she whistled quietly before setting to work. There weren't many places on her doll where she could carve in the rune. The only place that would work would be on the doll's wooden beak. Moving slowly, Tika took up a wood chisel and started to carefully carve the flight rune into the beak. The monocle proved to be a godsend on this occasion, helping her to make sure she didn't overstep her boundaries or get the shape wrong. She thought back to every time she'd watched Brad enchanting something and tried to match his work step for step. She even mimicked his frustrated grumbles, even though she was giddy with excitement. Slowly but surely, Iza had been engraved into the doll's beak. Stifling a little squeal of delight, Tika turned her attention to the box of ring stones. She picked out one that was about the size of her doll's head. It was a naturally shaped thing, with any sharp edges long ago sanded down to make it easy and safe to handle. It glowed gently in her hand, and that glow might as well have been a little devil on her shoulder screaming at her to just do it. So she did. Switching tools, she set to work trying to carve the same symbol into the stone. It was decidedly harder than with the wood, and she actually found herself in need of something to hold the stone in place, lest she sent it rocketing across the room to smash into something valuable. Luckily, Bradigen was always prepared, and had a vise in the room for her to appropriate. With the aid of that, and a few beads of sweat, she slowly began to etch Iza into the stone. Any and all dust that fell from the stone as she worked was carefully caught in a small metal dish for later. Satisfied, Tika brought the dish and the stone back to the table. Her hands were shaking now. She wasn't entirely sure how long before Bradigen came back, and she was starting to get anxious. The rune wasn't particularly deep on either the doll or the stone, just deep enough to be clearly defined. She didn't actually know how deep she had to make them. It never seemed consistent when Bradigen was working, but she also knew it couldn't have been random. She swallowed a lump building in her throat.
Okay, might as well go all the way.
She mumbled. She flattened the doll out on the table and carefully slipped the ring stone inside of it, through one of the many holes in its old body. Then, she carefully poured the contents of the dish into the rune on the beak, using a little spoon to keep any from spilling out. She wasn't entirely sure how she managed to avoid spilling anything, but she did. She carefully smoothed out the dust in the rune on the beak until it was evenly distributed. There was just one last step, sealing it up and hoping it took. She dipped a brush, usually reserved for her claws or her beak, into her jar of polish and carefully ran it over the rune on the small wooden cone. The polish helped protect her nails, so she figured it would probably serve the same purpose here. Now, there was no good reason that what happened next should have happened. Tika was working utterly blindly. She had been watching and assisting Bradigen for years, but had not received any formal instruction in the finer points of enchanting in all that time, other than not yet. She had taken no measurements. She had made no sketches or plans. By every possible statistic, every single measurement of probability, there was no way that this should have worked. But, assuming one used a loose definition of the word, then yes, Tika's enchantment somehow did in fact work. Her heart swelled with joy as a moment later, the rune in her doll suddenly glowed brighter than before, and with the beak leading the way like the snoot of a fox going after rodents in the snow, it lifted into the air. The rest of the doll's body hung limply under the beak, swaying a little bit, and the wings weren't flapping at all, but Tika didn't mind.
I did it! I did it!
She squealed, her hands balling up into fists over her heart. She hopped merrily in place, her voice slipping into her native tongue.
I did it! I made it fly! Ha! Take that, Brad! I can enchant stuff!
Now, poor, sweet, innocent, and ignorant little Tika had no way of knowing this. But her enchantment was the definition of sloppy. All she told the doll to do was fly. But when working with magic, precision is key. There were no instructions on how high it should fly, how fast, at what angle, or if any consideration should be given to anything around it. And so, as a result of this conceptual freedom, it was at around this time that the doll decided to go on a rampage. Needless to say, little Tika felt just the slightest bit offended when her beloved doll suddenly turned and flew right into the monocle, beak first, like a frenzied woodpecker. She let out a loud and indignant squawking noise as she flailed back off the footstool she had been standing on to crash to the floor in a crumpled heap. Taking off the now cracked monocle, she scrambled to her feet and looked on in horror as her doll flew randomly through the air. It twisted and turned in ugly and unnatural patterns, utterly devoid of the grace and elegance Jeta had imbued it with. And then the doll flew into one of Bradigen's many carefully kept cubbies, sending jars and bottles falling to smash and shatter into tiny little particles against the floor. The smell of odd chemicals mingling with one another filled the air, and Tika realized that she might have made a terrible mistake.
Wait! Stop!
She called to the deaf doll, chasing it in a futile attempt to keep it from ruining Bradigen's shop.
Come back! Bad doll!
The doll scraped itself along the wall, heedless to her cries and admonishments, dipping into cubby after cubby as it went. Tools and jars and boxes fell to the floor one after another, filling the air with the clattering cacophony of Tika's error. She saw it dart into one cubby and then not emerge. A ladder sat against the wall right beside it, and she spied her chance. If she could catch the doll and break the shape of the rune, then she could break the enchantment. Moving swiftly, she clambered up the ladder for the cubby. Peering inside, she saw the doll just kind of flopping about like an offended salmon in the very back. Tika clacked her beak and reached out for the doll.
Come on,
she whispered to it.
Come on.
The doll's direction changed again, and it flew out of the cubby, zipping right past Tika's head. She squawked again and tried to catch it as it shot past, to no avail. The ladder came away from the wall from the sudden shift of her weight, and she felt a thrill of panic. She said a word then, but for the sake of a polite recounting of this event, we'll not be repeating it here. The ladder fell across the work table with a crash, and Tika screamed all the way down, clutching onto the rungs for dear life, her eyes squeezed shut. Her weight near the ladder's end caused it to pivot over the table, sending what was its bottom pointing up towards the ceiling and depositing Tika roughly but safely onto the floor of the workshop. A second later, she cracked her eyes open and looked up at the roof. The doll was pressing its face into the ceiling, the body swinging around lazily under it. Tika puffed up in frustration. She rose to her full height, dusting herself off.
Come down here,
she shouted.
You're ruining Brad's shop!
The doll, as if taking that as an invitation to keep ruining Brad's shop, darted down for the wall opposite the cubbies. Tika grabbed at her head, hands entangled in her feathers as the doll went darting into a desk filled with parchment and papers. Manifests, ledgers, and letters of great importance to the business, no doubt. Tika ran after the doll, hoping to catch it before it had a chance to do too much damage. She underestimated the power of the doll, however, for just as she reached the desk, a thick book with a green cover was sent flying up into her face. She held her hands out in front of her, more to catch herself than the doll now, teetering back on the balls of her feet. With long, stiff strides, she covered the remaining distance with her beak pointed squarely at the ceiling. When her momentum came to an end, the book fell to the floor with a defeated thump. The doll had left the desk already, but Tika could still hear it thumping around somewhere in the workshop. She turned this way and that, her little hands squeezing tightly into fists over and over as her mind raced. What was she going to do? She had to catch it and stop this before it could do any more damage, but there was no way to predict what it would do. It was acting completely at random. Combine that with its small size and high speed, and the darn thing was basically impossible to catch with her hands. Looking around once again, she saw the doll zooming out of a nearby cubby, sending another handful of tools falling to the floor. It arced down, smashed into the floor, and then slid along it until it disappeared under a woodworking table at the far end of the room. And now Tika spied another chance, and an idea came to her. She quickly peeled off her shirt as she ran after the doll, trusting in her feathers to protect her modesty, and jumped up on top of the table. She cringed as she accidentally knocked a few tools over in the process.
Sorry!
She apologized to no one in particular. She tied a few of those tools onto her shirt's sleeves, then held it up like a big net, her round eyes peeking over the top, and waited. The doll thumped around beneath the table for a few more seconds. Tika was so focused on that sound, waiting for any movement, that she didn't hear the sound of the front door of the building being opened. The doll suddenly shot out from the table. With an adorable battle shriek, Tika leapt down, casting her shirt after the escaping object as she went. It fell over the doll right before it left the floor, and Tika landed on top of the squirming pile of cloth an instant later.
Gotcha!
She cried out, clamping down on the doll hidden in her shirt as tight as she could. A second later, she was able to reach in and pull out the offending object. It squirmed and wriggled in her grasp, and she was surprised by the raw strength the thing had as it tried to fly out of her hands. Still, she held on, her claws like a vice, and curled her fingers around its neck to hold the head steady. With a victorious cry, she scratched the tip of her claw across the rune in the beak. The doll spasmed and jerked in her hands before, with a quiet thrum of magic, it fell limp in her hands. And then the door to the workshop slammed open.
Tika?
Tika's moment of triumph ended as soon as it had started, as she came to the definitive conclusion that she was about to die. She shriveled up in place on the floor, blushing furiously with embarrassment, and turned to look at the door. Bradigen stood there, gawping at her and the rest of his beloved workshop with wide eyes and a hanging jaw.
"Hi, Brad,"
she greeted weakly, giving him her biggest, best smile. His eyes locked onto her, and the red in his cheeks, she knew, was of building rage. "Tika, what the fuck?"
"I'm sorry,"
she cut him off, throwing herself at his feet to grovel.
"I'm so sorry. It was an accident, I swear. I didn't mean to. The doll just went nuts. I tried to stop it, but I wasn't fast enough and it broke your things, and I couldn't catch it, and...
Your doll? Bradigen echoed incredulously. What the blazes are you going on about, girl? My workshop's in ruins. Have you any conception of how much bloody money it's going to take to repair all this? And put your shirt back on! Tika jumped at the shout, but quickly did as she had been instructed. It took longer than she would have liked to remove the tools from her sleeves, and she realized that, somewhere under Bradigen's infuriated shouting, she had started crying. She hadn't even realized it. An immeasurable surge of guilt washed over her, and the knowledge that she had disappointed the man that had been so kind to her for so long filled her with more shame than she knew what to do with. She waited for Bradigen to continue his screaming tirade, but it never came. A few seconds after she had gotten her shirt back on, she heard Bradigen sigh and felt his large, warm hands grasping her shoulders and lifting her up to her feet. She reluctantly looked up into his eyes, sniffling as tears traced wet lines down her beak. The immediate fury was gone from Bradigen's face, though he was still clearly unhappy with her. He looked down at the floor behind the table, sniffed, and cringed. Chemicals spilled. Come on, let's get out of here. Don't want to be inhaling that mess. Tika was quiet as Bradigen ushered her out of the workshop and back to the dining room. He sat her down on one end of the table and took the chair across from her. He steepled his fingers in front of his face and took in a long, deep breath.
Am I in trouble?
Tika asked, berating herself a moment later for what was, obviously, a very stupid question. Bradigen nodded. You're swimming with the sharks, lass, he told her in a firm but level tone. Now, start from the beginning. I was gone for barely an hour. What happened? And what was all this about your doll? Tika took a deep breath, sniffed, wiped away some tears, before setting her doll down on the table in front of her. She slid it across towards Bradigen.
I was reading the dictionary you gave me,
she explained in barely more than a whisper.
And I found the rune for fly, Iza. And I remembered what Jeta did with my doll when he was here the other day, and I wanted to make my doll do that again.
As she recounted the story, she started talking faster and faster.
I thought the fly rune was all I needed, so I took the doll into your shop and used your things, and it flew, but it didn't fly like Jeta made it, and it started knocking over your things, and I tried to catch it, but it was too fast, so I used my shirt like a net, and I caught it, and—
Wait, stop. Bradigen cut her off, lifting a hand. She clamped her beak shut with a clacking noise and went rigid, staring at Bradigen. His eyes had flown wide. He lifted the doll in his hands and looked it over for several moments. A second later, the ringstone Tika had used fell out of one of the holes in the body and clattered to the table, putting the rune she had carved into it on full display. Bradigen looked at the stone in shock, then looked at the doll's beak. He ran his thumb over the ruined rune in amazement. You did this? He asked, his voice low with astonishment. Tika, in her emotional state, misunderstood the meaning of his tone. She flinched and hunched up in her seat, screwing her eyes tightly shut as the tears came again.
I'm so sorry, Brad,
she whimpered.
I didn't mean to. It was an accident. Please don't stop teaching me. I'll be good. I promise. I won't ever disobey you again. Just don't send me away.
Bradigen blinked at her in surprise before setting the doll down. Tika? Oh, my sweet little bird, why on Aurus would I ever send you away? He asked, hurt in his voice.
Because I ruined your shop,
Tika said, burying her face in her hands.
I broke your things. I did what you told me not to do, and I enchanted my doll. You were right. It was dangerous and it went wrong. I won't ever do it again, I promise.
Hey, Tika, hey, that's enough, Brad said, rising from his seat and crossing over to wrap her up in a tight hug. Tika squawked, surprised, but hugged him back, her hands latching together tightly behind Brad's neck. The dwarf ran his hand down the back of Tika's head, quietly shushing her, and slowly but surely the familiar warmth and comforting motions helped Tika get a hold of herself. I'd never send you away, Bradigen whispered to her. He set her back down on the seat, giving her an affectionate smile. You're my apprentice, but you've been like a daughter to me since I took you in. Like hell would I send you away for something like this.
But I ruined your shop,
Tika argued, not quite understanding. Bradigen nodded. Yeah, you did do that. But you know what you also did? Tika blinked.
What?
Bradigen's face lit up with an enormous grin. You enchanted something, he declared, taking Tika by the shoulders and lifting her up into the air over his head. By my beard and all the gods above, Tika, you enchanted something! Suddenly being high up in the air made Tika laugh involuntarily. A quiet giggle of a laugh, but still, it felt good. She cast her eyes back down toward the doll, and her mirth faded in a heartbeat.
But it went wrong.
Oh, it did, Bradigen agreed. And you rightly shouldn't have. But the enchantment worked. It did exactly what you told it to do. The runes were perfect, Tika. If you'd gotten them wrong, there's a good chance your doll would have just lit on fire. Tika blinked a few times, taken aback. She had been thinking that she had royally screwed up the enchantment entirely.
But it...
Brad's skin grew as he put Tika back down. It did exactly what you told it to do. You told it to fly. What you didn't tell it was everything else you needed to. Where to fly, when to fly, why to fly, or how fast to fly. And you stuffed the ringstone in an open cavity without making sure it was secure. That's why the doll went nuts. As it moved around, the stone rolled around. That made the energy the stone gave the doll go all out of whack. And that made the doll move weird and funny-like, and that in turn jostled the stone even more, and it all just became a vicious cycle, you see? Tika swallowed a lump in her throat, but slowly nodded.
I think so,
she said softly, tapping the tips of her claws together. She looked up at Bradigen while keeping her beak pointed squarely at the floor.
So what happens now?
Bradigen's smile faded. He ran his fingers through his beard, and she could see the hard look returning to his eyes. Well, shit, hadn't really thought about that yet, he muttered. Tika, sensing a chance to lighten the mood, perked up a little.
Swear jar,
she said. Bradigen snorted out a short laugh, but did not otherwise respond. After a few seconds, he clapped his hands together. All right, so here's what I'm thinking. You managed to enchant your doll. Now, it was a right terrible enchantment, and you made a lot of mistakes, but fact remains, you managed to technically make a working enchantment. That tells me that you've either been paying very good attention, or you just have some luck goddess's favor. Either way, Bradigen knelt down to be closer to Tika's eye level. You done proved me wrong, little miss. and you aren't getting any younger either. So how about this? Once we get that mess cleaned up, I'll start teaching you how to enchant properly. Tika's eyes flew wide.
What? Really?
Bradigen nodded. Aye. For you to pull that off the way you did, you gotta be an absolute natural at this. I always figured you'd be good, it's why I took you on, but now? His smirk was one that filled Tika with hope for the future. You might just have more potential than I do. So, you help me clean up the mess you made, and we'll get you started earlier than I'd been planning. Tika leaned forward, her guilt all but forgotten.
Yes, please. Thank you, Brad. Thank you.
She squealed before throwing herself against him in another hug. He chuckled, returning the embrace. Just so we're clear, though, young lady, you are absolutely grounded. And Tika's joy dried up just like that.
Oh,
she mumbled. And your allowance is going to be put to helping replace all the stuff you broke. I trust that's a fair trade. Tika felt a little dejected at the idea of losing her allowance. She would often spend that money on sweet treats and shiny things. But if losing out on those little luxuries for a while was the price she had to pay to start her lessons?
Deal,
she said, without hesitation, giving Bradigen another squeeze.
Thank you, Brad.
Bradigen patted her on the back and pulled away to plant a big old kiss on her forehead. He then reached out and ruffled her head feathers with his hand, drawing a protesting chuckle out of her. No problem. Now come on, you little troublemaker. That mess ain't gonna clean itself. Grab a cloth, cover up your beak, and let's get to work, he said. He gave her a firm clap on the back to send her into motion. Not that he had any need to do so. Tika was already running from the chair. Now be careful near those chemicals, kid, Brad said when they opened the door to the workshop again, loaded down with mops and bags to store the debris in. Those things can be scary if you breathe in the wrong mixture. Don't take off your mask or your gloves, don't stick your fingers in it, and if your eyes start burning or you start coughing, get out. Stick close, do what I tell you, you hear? Little Tika nodded her assent, clacking her beak repeatedly with excitement.
Yes, Bradigen, I will,
she said, before allowing herself to be swept up in a warm, muscly embrace from her dearest teacher. Bradigen grinned. All right then, let's get to work.